The garden party had barely reached its second hour when Camille Voss walked straight toward Eleanor Whitfield with fire in her eyes. Every guest turned to watch. Eleanor barely had time to set down her glass of lemonade before Camille's hand rose in the air, aimed directly at her face. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor closed her eyes, bracing for the impact that never came. A firm hand had caught Camille's wrist just inches from Eleanor's cheek. The garden fell silent. Every head turned to see who had intervened. It was Edmund Hale, the Duke of Foxmere, a man known for avoiding society gatherings and speaking to almost no one. His grip on Camille's wrist was calm but unshakable. He did not raise his voice. He simply said that violence had no place among people who called themselves refined. Camille yanked her arm back, cheeks burning with embarrassment, and stormed off through the hedges without another word. Nathaniel Grant, Eleanor's husband, stood frozen near the fountain, saying nothing in her defense. He did not rush to her side. He did not ask if she was hurt. Instead, his eyes followed Camille's retreat, as if worried more about her feelings than his wife's safety. Eleanor felt the weight of every stare on her skin. Whispers began almost immediately, guests leaning toward each other, exchanging theories about what had just happened, and why a woman would dare slap another in front of the entire party. Eleanor kept her chin high, though her hands trembled at her sides. The Duke released Camille's wrist and turned to face Eleanor directly. His expression softened, though his eyes remained sharp with quiet anger. He asked if she was all right, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Eleanor nodded, though the truth was far more complicated. She was not all right. She had not been all right for a long time. The marriage she had built her life around had quietly crumbled behind closed doors, and now the cracks were becoming public for everyone to see. The Duke offered his arm and walked her away from the crowd, giving her a moment to breathe before the whispers grew louder. As they moved past the roses, Eleanor caught sight of Nathaniel finally following Camille toward the garden gates, abandoning his own wife in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle. It was in that single moment, surrounded by manicured hedges and painted parasols, that Eleanor understood something she had refused to admit for years. Her husband had already chosen his side, and it was not hers. The Duke said nothing further, but his presence beside her spoke louder than any words could. For the first time since the humiliation began, Eleanor felt like someone finally saw her, not as a wife who had failed to keep her husband's attention, but as a woman who deserved far better than what she had been given. As the party slowly resumed its polite conversations and forced laughter, Eleanor knew that nothing about her life would ever return to what it had been before that afternoon. By morning, the story had already spread across every drawing room in the city. Servants whispered it to other servants, and those servants carried it to their employers over breakfast tables. Eleanor sat alone in the study, staring at a letter that had arrived without a name attached. It was written in careful handwriting, asking only if she was safe and offering help should she ever need it. She recognized the seal pressed into the wax. It belonged to the Duke of Foxmere. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, unsure what to feel. Nathaniel returned home late that night, smelling faintly of perfume that was not hers. He barely looked at her when he walked through the door. Instead of apologizing for abandoning her at the party, he accused her of embarrassing him in front of his associates. He said she should have simply walked away instead of drawing attention to herself. Eleanor listened in disbelief as her husband twisted the entire event, making her the villain of a story where she had done nothing but stand still. She thought back to the early years of their marriage, when Nathaniel had promised her a life filled with partnership and respect. Somewhere along the way, ambition had replaced affection, and Camille had become a convenient distraction from a marriage he no longer wanted to maintain. Eleanor realized she had spent years excusing his coldness, blaming herself for not being enough. That night, she opened the drawer again and read the letter a second time. There was something steady in the words, something that reminded her she was not imagining her own mistreatment. The next afternoon, she received an invitation to a private tea, hosted by the Duke's sister, who claimed to have long admired Eleanor's grace under pressure. Alina suspected it was the Duke's quiet way of checking on her without overstepping any boundaries. She accepted, if only to escape the suffocating silence of her own home for a few hours. At the tea, surrounded by unfamiliar but kind faces, Alina spoke more freely than she had in years. She laughed at a joke without forcing it. She answered questions without measuring every word for Nathaniel's approval. When the Duke arrived briefly to greet his sister's guests, his eyes found Alina across the room, and for a moment the noise of the gathering faded around them. He did not approach her directly, respecting the line between concern and impropriety, but his glance carried a quiet reassurance that she was not alone in noticing what had happened. Walking home that evening, Alina made a decision that surprised even herself. She would no longer stay silent about the disrespect she had endured. She would no longer smile through humiliation to protect a reputation that was never truly hers to protect. Something inside her, long buried under years of quiet obedience, had finally begun to wake up. Alina waited until Nathaniel finished his dinner before speaking her mind. She told him plainly that she knew about Camille, that she had known for longer than he realized, and that she was done pretending otherwise. Nathaniel's expression shifted from surprise to irritation within seconds. He accused her of overreacting, insisting that every man in his position had similar arrangements and that she should simply accept it quietly like other wives did. His words landed like ice water, confirming every fear she had carried for years. There was no shame in his voice, only frustration that she had dared to bring it into the open. Alina asked him directly how long the relationship with Camille had lasted. His hesitation before answering told her everything she needed to know. It had been going on far longer than she had ever suspected, hidden behind business trips and late meetings that never truly existed. She left the dining room without finishing the conversation, her heart pounding but her resolve growing stronger with every step. Later that week, she received another note, this time requesting a meeting at the Duke's estate regarding a legal matter he believed she should be aware of. Alina arrived cautiously, unsure what to expect. The Duke explained, with careful respect for her feelings, that Nathaniel's business dealings had recently drawn attention from investors who suspected mismanagement of funds. He had uncovered information suggesting Nathaniel had used family money, money that belonged partly to Alina through inheritance, to fund gifts and properties for Camille. Alina sat in stunned silence, absorbing the full scope of the betrayal. It was not only her heart that had been deceived, but her financial security as well. The Duke offered to connect her with a solicitor who specialized in protecting the interests of wives in situations like hers, someone discreet and trustworthy. Alina thanked him, grateful that someone finally treated her as capable of handling difficult truths rather than someone to be shielded from them. Meanwhile, Camille had grown bolder, believing herself untouchable given Nathaniel's continued attention. At a private dinner among mutual acquaintances, Camille made a pointed remark about Alina's supposed inability to keep her own household in order. The room grew tense, but before anyone could respond, one of the guests mentioned overhearing details about missing funds connected to Nathaniel's recent investments. Camille's confident smile faltered slightly, though she quickly recovered and changed the subject. Alina, seated quietly nearby, said nothing, letting the truth work on its own without her needing to raise her voice. She thought of the Duke's earlier words about patience being sharper than any blade. For the first time in months, she felt something resembling control returning to her life, piece by piece, as the truth slowly unraveled the carefully built image Nathaniel had spent years protecting. Weeks passed, and Alina began meeting regularly with the solicitor the Duke had recommended. Together, they built a clear picture of how much of her inheritance had quietly disappeared into accounts connected to Camille. Alina felt a strange sense of calm as she reviewed the documents, as though each page brought her closer to reclaiming something that had been stolen from her for years. During one of these meetings, the Duke arrived briefly to check on the progress, and Alina found herself sharing more than legal details. She spoke of her childhood, her early hopes for marriage, and the slow erosion of her confidence over the years. The Duke listened without interrupting, offering neither pity nor false comfort, only genuine attention. He mentioned, briefly and without self-pity, that he understood betrayal from personal experience, having once trusted someone who used his name for their own gain. This shared understanding created a quiet bond between them, built not on flattery but on mutual respect. Meanwhile, Nathaniel grew increasingly desperate as rumors about his financial troubles spread through his business circles. Investors began withdrawing support, unwilling to associate with a man whose judgment appeared compromised by personal indulgence. In a final attempt to regain control, Nathaniel confronted Alina at home, demanding she publicly deny the rumors and stand beside him at an upcoming business dinner to restore his reputation. Alina refused calmly, stating that she would not lie for a man who had shown her no loyalty in return. Furious, Nathaniel threatened to cut her off entirely, claiming she would have nothing without his name attached to her. Alina, prepared for this exact moment, calmly informed him that her solicitor had already secured her rightful share of the inheritance, protected long before this conversation ever took place. Nathaniel's confidence crumbled as he realized she was no longer the passive wife he once controlled. That same evening, the Duke arrived at Alina's request, not to fight her battles for her, but to stand as a witness to the truth being spoken plainly. His presence alone reminded Nathaniel that his actions had not gone unnoticed by people of influence. Nathaniel stormed out, slamming the door behind him, his authority within their home finally broken. Alina stood in the quiet aftermath, feeling lighter than she had in years. The Duke offered a small, reassuring nod, acknowledging her strength rather than taking credit for it. For the first time, Alina understood that reclaiming her life did not require revenge, only clarity, patience, and the courage to stop accepting less than she deserved. The formal separation moved forward quietly but firmly, guided by the solicitor's careful work and Alina's growing resolve. News of Nathaniel's financial mismanagement eventually reached the wider business community, and the same investors who once admired him now distanced themselves entirely. His reputation, once carefully polished, crumbled under the weight of his own choices. Camille, seeing that Nathaniel no longer held influence or wealth to offer her, quietly disappeared from his life, moving on to pursue attention elsewhere without a second glance back. Nathaniel was left with neither his mistress nor the woman who had once stood loyally by his side. Alina, meanwhile, began rebuilding her life on her own terms. She moved into a modest but comfortable home, purchased with the inheritance she had fought to protect. She spent her mornings tending a small garden of her own, free from the performance of appearances that had once dictated her every move. The Duke visited occasionally, always respectful of her need for independence, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. Over time, their conversations grew warmer, filled with genuine laughter rather than careful politeness. One afternoon, as they walked together through the same gardens where her humiliation had once unfolded in front of dozens of onlookers, the Duke gently acknowledged how far she had come since that day. Alina smiled, admitting that the moment he caught Camille's wrist had been the beginning of her seeing her own worth clearly for the first time. The Duke, in his usual quiet manner, said that he had simply refused to stand by while someone was treated unfairly, nothing more. Alina understood, however, that his actions had meant far more than he allowed himself to admit. As autumn settled over the city, the Duke formally began courting Alina, this time openly and with full respect for her independence. Society, once quick to whisper about her humiliation, now spoke of her resilience and quiet strength instead. Alina walked into gatherings with her head held high, no longer defined by another person's betrayal, but by her own choices and newfound confidence. She had learned that dignity could not be slapped away by cruelty, nor stolen by deceit, only reclaimed through patience and self-respect. As she stood beside the Duke at a small gathering months later, surrounded by people who now admired rather than pitied her, Alina finally understood that her story had not ended in humiliation. It had only just begun, this time written entirely on her own terms.